The spoon tapped once against the teacup as my only son leaned back and said, "It's just a house, Mom, you don't need it." As I stirred my tea, I didn't flinch, just watched the steam rise like every sacrifice he'd never seen. While his voice filled the room with numbers and market talk, the silence from the walls grew louder. The same silence that buried my father held my marriage and raised that boy through every damn storm. That's when the appraiser turned pale and whispered, "Sir, this property predates the county itself." So I smiled into my cup, because the house remembered what my son chose to forget. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence, it lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. Sunday dinner had always been simple in Elaine Miller's home, nothing extravagant, nothing hurried. The old craftsman walls held warmth the way a good book held stories, and Elaine moved through the kitchen with steady, practiced motions. She set out her mother's linen runner, placed the stoneware plates carefully, and adjusted the lamp in the corner until the room glowed with a soft amber hue. Kyle and Dana stepped inside just as she opened the oven. Kyle scanned the living room first, his eyes tracking the ceiling beams, the aged fireplace, the narrow stairway that bent toward the second floor. Dana followed him with the assessing focus of someone touring a property rather than visiting family. They sat, and conversation limped forward, small remarks about traffic, work, the weather along the coast. Elaine answered with gentle nods, never rushing, never inviting conflict, but she felt the tension taking shape before the words even arrived. Kyle leaned back in his chair partway through the meal, fingers tapping lightly against the table. "Mom, we've been talking," he began, tone too casual to be innocent. "There might be a better plan for this place." Elaine refilled her teacup without looking at him. "You could downsize," he continued, "move somewhere easier, and we could put this property to work instead of letting it sit." Dana added smoothly, "You don't use the upstairs, and the yard is far too much for one person. A smaller home would make life simpler." Elaine's hand stayed steady as she poured more tea. She offered a quiet neither agreeing nor resisting. The house creaked faintly above them as if responding on her behalf. Kyle pushed a little farther, describing market spikes and long-term financial strategy, while Dana nodded at every point, her gaze drifting over the room as though identifying which parts she'd remove first. Elaine listened, but she let her silence do the heavy lifting, not defensive silence, measured silence. They finished eating, though no one seemed to taste much. When Elaine cleared the plates, Kyle stood near the door, slipping into the tone he used when he felt entitled to the final word. "It's just a house, Mom," he said. "You don't need it." He walked out without waiting for her response. Dana gave a tight, polite smile before following him. The door closed and the house exhaled. Elaine stood still, hearing the distant echo of her husband's footsteps in the hall, the memory of her father sanding the banister, the laughter of neighbors from summers long gone. Nothing about the space felt empty. It felt earned. She turned off lights one by one and climbed the stairs, placing her hand along the railing as she had hundreds of times. The landing sighed softly beneath her feet. In the smallest bedroom, a space untouched for years, she opened the storage closet and pulled out a cedar chest whose brass hinges had grown dull with age. The scent of cedar rose immediately when she lifted the lid. Wrapped in muslin lay a stack of documents she had protected for half a lifetime. She unwrapped the top sheet carefully. The original title deed. Dated 1909. Signed by her grandfather in ink that had softened but never faded. Elaine stared at the signature, feeling the room still around her. She traced the edge of the parchment with a single finger, absorbing the weight of everything her son could not see: history, promises, foundations laid long before he was born. Kyle's words replayed faintly, "just a house." Her jaw set, calm but decisive. She returned the deed to its wrapping, closed the chest gently, and rose with a steadiness that surprised even her. If Kyle believed this place was expendable, he was about to learn how deeply he had underestimated the home and the woman who protected it. Morning light filtered through the kitchen windows in thin gold lines, settling across the tiled floor as Elaine wiped down the counter. The quiet steadiness of the house felt different today, alert, as though it sensed movement approaching. She'd barely finished her coffee when her phone buzzed. Kyle. His message was brisk, almost transactional. Agent coming tomorrow to evaluate the place. We need options. No greeting, no question, just a plan he assumed she would follow. Elaine read the message twice, then set the phone down with a calmness that didn't match the tightness deep in her chest. She knew the difference between concern and control. Kyle had crossed that line long ago, but last night's comment had sharpened the boundary. Just a house. She stepped into the living room, letting her fingers brush the edge of the mantel. The wood was warm from the sun, its grains still visible beneath the varnish her father had applied decades earlier. She didn't rush. Instead, she walked to her desk and pulled out a small card she had tucked away years ago. Tessa Holt, historical preservation consultant. She met Tessa at a community lecture about early craftsman architecture and had kept the card because something about the woman struck her as clear-eyed and deeply rooted. Elaine dialed. Tessa answered on the second ring, her voice calm and precise. Holt speaking. This is Elaine Miller, she said, keeping her tone light. I was hoping you might have time to evaluate my property. Something came up. The pause was brief, followed by a warm, absolutely. I can be there this afternoon. By early evening, Tessa stood on the front walk, her canvas bag slung over her shoulder. Her gaze moved slowly across the facade, not with the hunger of a buyer, but with the focus of someone reading a story line by line. She didn't comment at first, just moved closer, touching the porch railing gently, then stepping inside with deliberate care. The entryway seemed to catch her attention more than anything else. She halted beneath a large exposed beam, the one Elaine had dusted the night before. Tessa pressed her palm lightly against the wood, her expression sharpening with recognition. Do you know what this is? She asked quietly. Elaine shook her head. This isn't ordinary lumber, it's a signature green and green element, one of the early county variations. Very few homes built in that era still have original beams like this. Elaine studied her reaction. There was no exaggeration there, just genuine respect. Tessa moved room to room with the same quiet intensity, stopping to inspect joinery, hardware, window muntins, and the carved brackets near the staircase. Each time her expression deepened into something like disbelief. There are only 7 remaining structures influenced by their designs in this county, she murmured, and most have been altered heavily. Elaine said nothing until they reached her father's old study. She opened the bottom drawer of the file cabinet and lifted out a weathered folder tied with fabric string. Inside rested her grandfather's original sketches and early blueprints, lines drawn in careful strokes, notes scribbled in the margins. Tessa sat down slowly, almost reverently. These are extraordinary, she whispered. This changes the entire context of the property. For a moment, the room felt fuller, like the house itself had straightened its spine. As Tessa packed her materials, she promised to prepare a full report and hinted at possibilities Elaine had never considered. When she left, the house felt strangely awake, as if aware that someone had finally seen it for what it truly was. The next morning arrived with the dull thud of a car door. The real estate agent Kyle had selected strolled up the walkway with a clipboard and a distracted smile. He stepped inside without truly looking at anything, giving quick, dismissive glances at the woodwork and fixtures. Nice place, he said in a tone that suggested the opposite. But with the age, the condition, the layout, you'll be lucky to get $800,000. Elaine didn't flinch. She offered him a neutral nod, the same steady expression she used the night before when Kyle delivered his decree. The agent kept talking, praising modern efficiencies, gesturing at walls he'd knocked down and referencing buyers who aren't sentimental. Elaine escorted him out politely, closing the door behind him with quiet finality. The house settled into stillness, the air shifting ever so slightly across the entryway beam, the one Tessa had touched with such certainty. Elaine stood beneath it, her eyes lifting toward the ceiling as understanding sharpened into resolve. Kyle believed he had initiated an appraisal. He had no idea the real one had already begun. Late the next morning, the quiet hum of the house was interrupted by a soft knock. Elaine opened the door to find Tessa on the porch again, a slim binder tucked under her arm. There was a steadiness in her expression, professional, composed, but carrying a spark of excitement she hadn't shown the day before. "I went through everything you shared," Tessa said as they stepped inside. "Your home qualifies for landmark consideration, strongly." Elaine paused, absorbing the weight of those words. "And that would protect it." Tessa nodded. "Designation limits structural alteration and prohibits demolition. Developers can't touch it, not legally." A small breath left Elaine's chest, something between relief and quiet resolve. She rested a hand on the entryway beam, the same place where Tessa had stood yesterday. "How do I make that permanent?" she asked. Tessa's smile was subtle but confident. "I'll start the paperwork." They moved toward the dining room, spreading documents across the table. Tessa walked her through the process: county review, state evaluation, historical verification. Every step took the house further out of Kyle's reach. The idea settled into Elaine like a foundation stone she hadn't known she needed. An hour later, the sound of car doors cut through the calm. Kyle's voice carried first, abrupt and impatient. Dana's followed, clipped and directive. Elaine glanced at the clock. They hadn't warned her they were coming. Tessa gathered her binder. "Do you need space?" she asked gently. "Not at all," Elaine replied. "Stay as long as you'd like." The front door swung open before Elaine reached it. Kyle strode inside with a realtor she didn't recognize, tall, animated, and already speaking in enthusiastic gestures. Dana trailed behind, cataloging the walls with the air of someone preparing a shopping list. "We figured we'd take another look," Kyle announced, barely acknowledging Tessa. The realtor clapped his hands together. "So much potential here, you could open this whole area," he said, pointing to the load-bearing wall between the living room and study. "And upstairs, maybe remove that narrow hallway, turn it into a bright loft." Dana nodded eagerly. "And the kitchen could be modernized completely. Everything in here feels dated." Elaine remained near the counter, her presence quiet, her expression unreadable. She wasn't angry, she wasn't even surprised. She simply listened, watching them peel through the home as if it were a blueprint without history, without weight, without people who had shaped it. Tessa stood to the side, lips pressed together, observing every insensitive suggestion with professional restraint. When they moved on to the staircase, Elaine slipped outside to the front porch for a breath of cooler air. Seconds later, she heard footsteps behind her. Ron Jacobs, her late husband's oldest friend, walked up the path carrying a bag of hardware supplies. "I was in the neighborhood," he said. "Wanted to check that beam I told you about." Elaine led him inside, where the realtor was still talking about layout options. Ron raised his brows but didn't comment. Instead, he studied the framework with practiced eyes, the joints, the grain, the alignment of original supports. "It's all intact," he said finally. "Remarkably so. Your husband always said this place had good bones. He was right." The words landed softly but carried meaning deeper than praise. Elaine felt something in her chest settle, the way a door closes when you finally know which side you belong on. Kyle finally noticed Ron and frowned. "What are you doing here?" "Checking on a house that doesn't need fixing," Ron replied, his tone even. Kyle didn't argue, but the irritation in his eyes sharpened. When they left, the house felt noticeably calmer, almost relieved. Elaine walked straight to her study, sat at her desk, and opened the preservation packet Tessa had prepared. No hesitation, no wavering. She filled out the preliminary application with a steady hand, signed her name, and uploaded every document. She didn't tell Kyle. She didn't need to. As she hit submit, the confirmation message glowed on the screen, a quiet, decisive promise. Once the process started, there would be no undoing it. And Kyle was about to learn he was far too late to pull the strings he thought he controlled. The next morning unfolded slowly, the house carrying a quiet confidence after the decision Elaine had made the day before. She sat at the dining table with a cup of mint tea, reviewing the confirmation email from the preservation office when tires crunched across the gravel outside. Through the window, she saw a man step out of a sedan, clipboard, measuring tape, and a badge clipped to his pocket. A bank appraiser. Elaine placed her teacup down with deliberate care. She opened the door before he could knock. "Mrs. Miller," he asked, offering a polite smile, "here to complete the interior assessment." Elaine held the frame of the door lightly. I won't be allowing an entry inspection today. His smile faltered. Your son said. I'm aware of what he said, she replied calmly, but this is my home and access is not permitted. Before he could respond, another car pulled up hastily. Kyle stepped out, frustration written across his posture with Dana right behind him. They hurried toward the porch. You agreed to this, Dana insisted, brushing past the appraiser as though he were merely an accessory to her urgency. Elaine's gaze didn't waver. No, I didn't. I said I would be present. Kyle tried to soften the moment with a sigh, resting his hand on the railing like he owned it. Mom, come on, we're just trying to help. Elaine's reply landed with a quiet precision. Help yourselves, it seems. The appraiser shifted uncomfortably on the step, sensing the shift in temperature even if he didn't know the history behind it. Elaine straightened, meeting his eyes. Thank you for coming, but there will be no evaluation today. He nodded with a professional stiffness, retreating down the walkway as Kyle muttered under his breath. Dana folded her arms, annoyance radiating from her posture. You're being unreasonable, she said. Elaine didn't bother answering. She simply closed the door, not slamming it, not rushing, just closing it with the unmistakable firmness of someone reclaiming territory. Inside, the house felt warmer again. She walked to her study and made a call she'd anticipated since yesterday. Tessa picked up immediately. Is everything all right? Tessa asked. A bank appraiser tried to enter, Elaine said, her voice steady. I'd like to move forward faster if that's possible. A beat of silence, then the decisive tone Elaine had come to trust. Let me connect you to zoning. There's a route we can take, an emergency review process for Atrisk structures. Minutes later, Elaine spoke with a zoning officer who recognized Tessa's name and handled the matter with surprising urgency. They discussed timelines, required documents, and early verification steps. By the time the call ended, the historic review had been fast-tracked and officially noted in the county system. Kyle couldn't undo a single piece of it. The afternoon passed quietly. Sunlight shifted across the hardwood floor as Elaine opened her safe and retrieved her estate binder. She set it on the kitchen table, the weight of it both familiar and strangely empowering. Her attorney had insisted years ago that she keep everything organized, just in case. Today, she felt grateful for that advice. She removed the outdated will and replaced it with a new one she had drafted weeks earlier but never finalized. Now she completed each line with a steady hand. The property is not to be sold. It may only be inherited under full preservation conditions. No heir may alter, demolish, or transfer ownership. Her pen didn't shake once. She signed, dated, sealed the document, and placed it back into the safe. The click of the lock echoed through the house, soft, firm, final. Outside, a car door slammed. Kyle's voice rose sharply, muffled through the walls. He was still on the porch, pacing, trying to regain footing he no longer had. Elaine didn't move toward the door this time. She watched from the hallway window as he raked a hand through his hair, clearly rattled, clearly realizing that something had shifted beneath him, something he couldn't control. He had no idea how much further it was about to go. 2 days later, the house sat in a rare hush, as if preparing for something it had been waiting a century to reveal. Elaine stood in the hallway, adjusting a framed map she had seen every day of her life but had never looked at closely. The parchment was yellowed, the ink faint, but the details were unmistakable. Roads long since renamed, parcels marked with numbers she suddenly recognized, and at the bottom in elegant cursive, Miller Subdivision 1908 filing. Her grandfather's mark. When Tessa arrived, she walked straight toward the map, stopping as though something had pulled her there. Is this original? She asked, her voice low. Elaine nodded. Tessa leaned in, tracing the edges without touching the glass. This is remarkable. This isn't just a document. This is the legal origin of the entire hill. She turned toward Elaine. Where did you get it? My father passed it to me, Elaine said. There's more. She motioned for Tessa to follow her into the study. In the corner stood a small steel vault box Elaine hadn't opened in years. Her hands didn't tremble as she keyed the code and lifted the lid. Inside lay folded papers, thick stock, official seals, wax remnants from another era. Tessa lifted one sheet carefully, her breath catching. These are founding trust deeds. Elaine eased into the chair across from her. My grandfather and his brothers owned the whole hilltop once. They sold parcels over decades to families they knew. But this, she tapped the documents gently, was always the anchor lot. It couldn't be sold to outside interests without a family signature. Tessa looked up sharply, and that clause is still valid. It is, Elaine replied. No one ever revoked it. The realization settled between them, solid, immovable, stronger than any appraisal or family pressure. Elaine's home wasn't just historically significant, it was legally insulated. By mid-afternoon, Kyle arrived, stomping up the steps with the impatience of someone expecting a victory speech. Dana followed, arms crossed tightly, eyes sharp with suspicion. We need to talk, Kyle said, brushing past Elaine and heading toward the dining table as if summoned there. This whole preservation thing, you're making choices without us. Elaine watched him circle the room like a man searching for leverage. The county called me, he went on, and they're claiming your house sits on a protected parcel. That can't be right. Tessa stepped forward before Elaine could speak. It's correct. The title history predates current zoning laws. The parcel is keystone. It cannot be rezoned or transferred for commercial use. Kyle blinked, stunned, not angry yet, just disoriented. So you're telling me, he said slowly, that this place is locked forever. The clause binds resale, Tessa clarified, meaning it can't be flipped, it can't be developed, it must remain what it is. Dana's expression shifted from impatience to fury. So this place is useless, she snapped. Elaine's response was soft, almost warm. Only to you. Silence spread through the room like a slow tide. Dana stared at her as if the ground had tilted beneath her feet. Kyle ran a hand through his hair, pacing, trying to piece together a new plan from shards that no longer fit. This isn't fair, he muttered. You should have told us. Elaine remained still, her posture calm, her voice even. There are things you never asked. Kyle opened his mouth to argue again, but his phone buzzed. He looked down, face tightening as he read the message. The county had sent the same notification to all listed relations. Historic review officially activated. Parcel under legal protection pending final ruling. Dana grabbed the phone from him and read it herself, color draining from her face. Elaine stepped back slightly, letting the weight of the moment settle. Tessa closed the vault box with careful precision. Kyle lifted his eyes toward his mother, and for the first time there was something close to fear in them, fear of losing something he had already assumed belonged to him. And Elaine hadn't even told him the whole truth yet. The morning of the inspection dawned cool and windless, the kind of stillness that made every sound sharper. Elaine stood on the porch long before the State Historic Board arrived, watching the fog lift from the hills like a curtain rising on a stage. The house seemed to hold its breath with her. By 9 o'clock, 2 cars pulled into the driveway, modest sedans carrying 4 board members, each stepping out with clipboards and neatly labeled folders. Their presence carried a sense of gravity, not intrusive but undeniably official. Elaine greeted them with the quiet confidence she'd earned over the last week, her pulse steady as she led them toward the entryway. She didn't bother glancing down the road when another car engine approached, but she knew who it was even before the tires stopped too close to her mailbox. Kyle and Dana climbed out with brisk, purposeful strides, the same expression on both of their faces, entitlement dressed as concern. We'll stand in for the family, Kyle announced as he reached the porch, positioning himself beside the inspectors before Elaine could speak. Elaine stepped between them with gentle firmness. No, she said, her voice low but unshakable, you are guests here today, nothing more. Dana's mouth opened in disbelief, but the board members exchanged quiet, professional nods and followed Elaine inside. Kyle and Dana stood frozen for a beat before trailing behind, forced to take their place at the edges of the group rather than the center. Inside, the inspectors began their systematic review. They started with the foyer, admiring the exposed beam Tessa had identified earlier. One of them crouched to examine the joinery, running a gloved finger along the grain. Another measured the spacing of the original wood panels with thoughtful precision. This level of preservation is highly unusual, one murmured. From the living room, another called out, "Look at this banister. No replacements, no modern screws, remarkable." Kyle shifted restlessly near the wall, arms folded tightly as if trying to reclaim authority through posture alone. Dana whispered suggestions to him, quick, agitated comments, but their voices hardly mattered in the broad hush of the inspection. Elaine stayed near the back, unobtrusive but attentive. She didn't interrupt, didn't guide, didn't try to influence anything. The house itself was speaking now. Tessa arrived a few minutes later, her binder in hand. The inspectors welcomed her immediately, recognizing her name from the application. She laid out the historical documents across the dining table, the founding deeds, the architectural notes, the early photographs Elaine had provided. "These support the continuity of design," Tessa explained, pointing to the oldest blueprint. "The structure aligns with period-specific green and green influences. You won't find many homes this intact." The board members leaned in, studying the paper with careful respect. One of them adjusted her glasses and exhaled slowly, as though absorbing the weight of a discovery. Kyle moved closer, trying to peer over their shoulders. "But you can still appraise it normally, right?" he asked too quickly. "You're not saying it can't be." A board member gently raised a hand, cutting him off. "We aren't here for market value, we're here to evaluate historical integrity." Dana muttered something under her breath, but no one responded. The inspectors continued their walkthrough, entering the den, the study, the narrow upstairs hallway that Kyle had once wanted to tear down. They stopped at the stained glass window at the top of the landing, the one Elaine's grandmother had designed. "Original leaded pattern," one said softly, "perfectly preserved." By the time they returned downstairs, the tone among the board had shifted from curiosity to reverence. Their questions became more detailed, their steps slower, their notes more deliberate. One of the inspectors, a man with silver hair and patient eyes, lingered behind as the group moved toward the dining room again. He turned to Elaine, lowering his clipboard slightly. "This home is a state treasure," he said in a quiet voice meant only for her. Elaine's chest tightened, not with fear but with something close to gratitude. Outside, through the window, she saw Kyle pacing near the driveway, his forehead creased, his movements clipped and restless. Dana stood beside him, gesturing sharply, her anger clear even through glass. Elaine looked back at the board member, whose expression held both respect and certainty. But the inspection was not over. And the next part would change everything. When the board finished its walkthrough, they gathered in the dining room, spreading documents and measurements across the polished wood table. The air had changed, no longer curious but weighted with something far more definitive. Elaine stood near the sideboard, hands folded loosely, watching the quiet exchange of nods between the inspectors. The lead appraiser, a woman with a calm, analytical expression, adjusted her glasses and cleared her throat. "Mrs. Miller," she began, "based on what we've seen, your home's preservation integrity is extremely rare. Even without development rights factored in, the structure and historical lineage place its preliminary valuation between $3.2 and $3.8 million. Kyle, who had been pacing near the doorway, froze mid-step. His face drained of color so abruptly that even Dana glanced at him in alarm. He stared at the appraiser as though she had spoken in another language. Dana's reaction came next, a slow, stunned sweep of her eyes across the room. Suddenly every detail mattered, the wood paneling she once called outdated, the beams she dismissed as old-fashioned, the narrow hallway she wanted to demolish. Her gaze kept darting from wall to wall like she was seeing the place for the first time. The board continued discussing structural findings, but their voices faded beneath Dana's whisper, sharp and furious. "You knew this the whole time, didn't you?" Elaine turned just enough to meet her eyes. "Not the whole time," she said evenly, "just long enough." Her voice wasn't triumphant, only steady. It was the steadiness of someone who had chosen patience over panic, truth over pressure. She stepped toward the kettle and began pouring tea into small porcelain cups she'd placed earlier. The gesture was simple, domestic, but it carried a quiet authority, reminding everyone in the room exactly whose house this was and whose history they were standing inside. The board members accepted the tea with polite gratitude. Tessa remained near them, answering detailed questions and providing the documents Elaine had entrusted to her. Meanwhile, Kyle stared at the appraisal notes as if they were slipping through his fingers. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "If it can't be developed, how is it worth that much?" The lead appraiser turned toward him, her tone professional but unmistakably firm. "Historic value doesn't disappear because development isn't allowed. In many cases, it increases." Kyle blinked, struggling to process the reality that every argument he'd made over the last week about efficiency, market value, modernization had evaporated beneath the weight of heritage he never bothered to understand. As the discussion shifted toward next steps, another car door shut outside. Moments later, Ron stepped quietly into the entryway, hat in hand, his boots carrying dust from the morning's work. He didn't interrupt, simply watched from the threshold until there was a natural pause. Then he moved to the staircase, resting his calloused hand on the banister that had survived 3 generations. "Your husband would be proud," he said softly, looking at Elaine with the kind of sincerity that didn't need embellishment. Elaine's throat tightened, but she managed a small nod. The banister gleamed in the afternoon light, the polished wood catching a familiar warmth. Her husband had spent hours restoring it during the year they married, sanding it until the grain rose like ripples in water. The appraisers shifted their attention again, discussing documentation requirements for state-level preservation. Then the lead appraiser glanced up, her tone serious. "There's another possibility," she said. "Given the age, condition, and architectural lineage, this home may qualify for the National Register of Historic Places." The room fell still. Even the air seemed to pause. Tessa exhaled slowly, a rare smile lifting the corner of her mouth. Dana stared blankly, unable to decipher whether this revelation was salvation or catastrophe. Kyle looked like someone watching a door close forever and realizing he was on the wrong side of it. Elaine didn't speak, she didn't need to, the home had spoken for her. But the board wasn't finished. And what they were about to recommend next would seal the fate of the house and Kyle's place in it for good. By late afternoon, the historic board had packed their clipboards and stepped outside, leaving the house quieter but filled with the echo of their verdict. Their cars rolled down the hill one by one, and for a brief moment the property felt suspended, like the air hadn't quite settled after what it had learned about itself. Elaine walked them out, thanked each member with her usual grace, and then returned to the dining room to begin clearing the teacups. She had barely lifted the first saucer when she heard the unmistakable sound of hurried footsteps re-entering the house. Kyle strode in first, jaw clenched tight, a thick envelope clutched in his hand. Dana followed close behind, her expression strained with urgency that bordered on desperation. They didn't bother with greetings. Kyle dropped the packet on the table. Papers spilled out, pages covered in legal language, tabs marking signatures, highlighted lines demanding initials. "So," he said, trying to sound calm but failing, "sign it. Let us handle everything." The edge in his voice wasn't frustration, it was fear. Fear of losing control, fear of losing the one thing he thought he already owned. Dana stepped forward, voice pitched just slightly softer, attempting a reasonable tone. "You can't live here alone, Elaine. This place is too much. We're trying to be responsible." Responsible? Elaine let the word hang there as though it were something fragile that might break under scrutiny. The kitchen light shifted as the sun dipped lower, casting bands of amber across the table. She didn't look at the papers, she looked at her son. He wouldn't meet her eyes. Without rushing, she moved to her study desk. Kyle's impatience followed her like static in the air. Dana fidgeted, adjusting her watch, glancing at the paperwork as if it were a lifeline. Elaine opened the second drawer, the one she had organized just after speaking with zoning, and removed a slim leather binder. Its surface was worn smooth from years of use, a sharp contrast to the crisp, untouched documents Kyle had thrown at her. She carried the binder back to the table and sat down, her posture composed, her movements steady. Kyle leaned forward slightly, hope flickering across his face, mistaking her silence for surrender. Elaine opened the binder to a page tucked behind a clear cover. She slid the document out carefully and placed it where the sunlight struck the signature line. "A medical capacity certification, signed last week, notarized, clear, complete." She said nothing, she didn't need to. Kyle's shoulders stiffened. His eyes darted to the heading statement of full cognitive competence and then to the doctor's name, the date, the official stamp that rendered every argument he had prepared useless. Dana's breath caught, her posture faltered as if she had leaned on a rail that suddenly wasn't there. Elaine kept her voice even. I make my own decisions. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was loud, filled with the sound of controls slipping from Kyle's grasp, falling to the floor in pieces he couldn't gather fast enough. Kyle reached for the papers he had brought, but his hand shook, a tremor, small but unmistakable. He tried to steady himself, but the document binder in front of his mother might as well have been a locked door. This isn't what we meant, he managed, but the words rang hollow. Elaine closed the binder with gentle finality. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't lean forward. She simply existed with a strength he had never taken the time to see. Dana finally stepped back, her confidence wavering. So what now? She whispered. Elaine didn't answer immediately. She watched the fading sunlight shift across the room, settling on the staircase banister her husband once restored. She let the question breathe. Then she looked directly at Kyle, her expression calm, resolute. What happens now, she said softly, is no longer up to you. Kyle swallowed hard, his hands still trembling. And he understood, perhaps for the first time, that whatever power he believed he held had vanished entirely. Morning crept in slowly, its pale light touching the edges of the dining room like a quiet reminder that certain truths could no longer be postponed. Elaine laid out 4 chairs around the table, nothing ornate, just the same wooden seats that had carried decades of conversations, celebrations, and arguments. Today they would carry something else, the final boundary she had refused to let Kyle cross. By 8 o'clock, Ron arrived first, hat in hand, giving her a nod that held more support than words ever could. Tessa walked in moments later, clutching her binder, though the reassurance in her eyes said she already knew that today wasn't about paperwork, it was about closure. Kyle and Dana entered last. His steps were slow, hesitant, unlike the confident strides he usually adopted when he believed he had the upper hand. Dana hovered behind him, expression tight as though bracing for a verdict she desperately hoped to influence. Elaine closed the dining room doors, not to trap anyone but to ensure the moment had the gravity it deserved. She took her seat at the head of the table and placed a sealed envelope in front of her. Its crisp edges contrasted with the worn wood beneath it. This, she said gently, is something I prepared long before any of this began. Kyle frowned. Mom. Elaine lifted a hand, and surprisingly he fell silent. She broke the seal with a steady motion. The sound was soft, almost ceremonial. She unfolded the document and began to read, her voice calm, unwavering. As of the date signed and witnessed, the property known as the Miller residence is placed permanently into the Miller Heritage Trust. Dana stiffened as though she'd been struck. Kyle's jaw tightened. Elaine continued, this trust prohibits sale, demolition, rezoning, and any transfer of ownership for commercial gain. The property shall remain preserved in accordance with state and historic guidelines. Kyle leaned forward abruptly. You can't just. Elaine kept reading, her tone composed. The trust will be administered by an executor of my choosing with a designated consultant for historical oversight. She looked up just long enough to acknowledge Ron. Ronald Jacobs will serve as executor. He understands both the structure and the history it carries. Ron gave a small, respectful nod, though the weight of the responsibility was clear in his eyes. Elaine turned to Tessa, and Tessa Holt will act as historic preservation consultant. Her expertise ensures the trust's purpose is upheld. Tessa's expression softened, touched by a respect she hadn't anticipated. Then Elaine returned to the will, her voice steady, the room utterly still. Kyle Miller appears in this document once, she read, listed under the category of restricted inheritance due to coercion. The words landed like a blow. Kyle inhaled sharply. Mom, that's not. Elaine didn't raise her voice. You tried to pressure me into relinquishing ownership of my home. The trust recognizes coercion as a disqualifying action. Dana covered her mouth with her hand, stunned. Elaine pressed on, the tone neither cold nor angry, just factual, final. and therefore no portion of the property or its assets will pass to you." Silence filled the room, dense and unmoving. Finally, she read the last clause. "The beneficiary of the Miller Heritage Trust upon my passing will be the Miller Community Education Fund, a nonprofit established to provide scholarships and resources to students pursuing history, architecture, and environmental studies." Kyle stared at her, disbelief breaking into something rower. "You're giving it away," he whispered, "to strangers." Elaine folded the will carefully, aligning the edges, her posture elegant even in the thick tension. "Not strangers, young people who will protect what you never valued." Dana swayed back in her chair, stunned, speechless. Kyle pushed his palms against the table as though trying to steady the world around him. "So that's it, after everything." Elaine looked at him with a gentleness that made the words even heavier. "That is it." But before anyone could react, the doorbell rang, sharp, urgent. Tessa exchanged a glance with Ron. Kyle froze. Elaine rose slowly, the will still in her hands. Whatever waited outside wasn't part of Kyle's script, but it was absolutely part of hers. 2 days after Elaine read the will, the tension in Kyle's shoulders still hadn't eased. He sat in a downtown San Luis Obispo law office, sleek glass walls, polished stone floors, and an atmosphere that smelled like expensive coffee and disappointment. Dana sat beside him, foot tapping, eyes narrowed at the framed degrees on the wall. The attorney, Martin Hale, finally entered the conference room. His demeanor was measured, his suit conservative, and his voice carried the polite detachment of someone who had already reviewed the file and knew exactly how this meeting would end. "I've looked through the documents you sent," Martin began as he took a seat. "You're contesting your mother's will on grounds of diminished capacity." Kyle nodded. It was stiff, forced, but it was all he had left to hold onto. "She's 71, she's been making emotional decisions, and she's been influenced by people outside the family." Martin folded his hands. "Do you have medical evidence of cognitive decline, any evaluations, doctor's notes?" Kyle opened his mouth, then closed it again. He had expected the attorney to guide him through loopholes, not ask for proof he didn't possess. Dana tried to recover. "Her behavior's changed. She's shutting us out. That has to count for something." Martin's expression remained unchanged. "Behavioral concerns aren't legal grounds. I need documented impairment." Kyle looked away, jaw clenched. Martin slid a folder across the table, not his own notes, but copies from the county file. "Your mother submitted a capacity evaluation last week, certified by a neurologist. She passed every metric: memory recall, executive function, decision-making." Dana blinked. "She planned this." "She prepared for this," Martin corrected gently. "There's also a notarized video statement confirming her voluntary decisions, date-stamped, filed properly." The words landed with the cold weight of finality. Kyle leaned back in his chair, frustration tightening every muscle in his face. "She's doing this to punish us." Martin didn't respond immediately. Instead, he opened Elaine's file with deliberate care. "Let me be candid," he said finally. "Your mother's paperwork is airtight. Every form is executed correctly. She consulted multiple professionals. There's a clear timeline showing she wasn't rushed, coerced, or impaired." Dana's voice cracked. "But doesn't any of this matter? Doesn't family count for something?" Across town, at that exact moment, Elaine stood in her garden pruning a row of lavender. She wasn't thinking of battles or paperwork, just breathing the cool afternoon air, grounding herself in the soil her husband once tended. "Family cares back," she had said the day she read the will. That sentence lingered like a shadow over this conference room. Back in the office, Martin closed the folder. "Let me advise you carefully," he said. "If you move forward with this challenge, the court will review your actions over the last several months. The pressure you placed on your mother, the power of attorney documents, the bank appraiser showing up at her door without clear consent." Dana swallowed hard. Kyle stared at the table, face draining of color. "The court may interpret those behaviors," Martin continued, "as coercive attempts to influence a vulnerable adult. If they do, you won't just lose the case. You could face public scrutiny, possibly legal consequences." Kyle's breathing quickened. "So you're telling me to give up?" Martin met his eyes without flinching. I'm telling you, this is a fight you cannot win." Silence filled the room, dense, suffocating. Dana placed a hand on Kyle's arm, but he didn't move. The reality had finally pierced whatever belief he had that he could manipulate the outcome. After a long moment, Martin stood. "If you want to maintain any relationship with your mother," he said gently, "walk away from this." He excused himself, leaving Kyle and Dana alone in the dim conference room. Dana spoke first, her voice barely a whisper. "What do we do now?" Kyle didn't answer. He was staring at the door, jaw tight, eyes dark, not defeated but simmering. And Elaine would soon learn that letting go of legal control didn't mean Kyle was finished trying to force his way back into her life. The morning after Kyle's legal attempt collapsed, Elaine stood at her front door with a quiet steadiness she hadn't felt in years. A locksmith's van was parked at the curb, its side panels reflecting the pale California sun. The locksmith worked efficiently, removing the old deadbolt and replacing it with a reinforced system that clicked into place with a definitive, satisfying sound. Elaine watched without apology. This wasn't shutting out family, this was reclaiming peace. When he finished, she signed the invoice and stepped inside, where a security technician was already walking her through the upgraded alarm panel. He asked her to test the code twice, then handed her a small remote with a simple explanation. "One press alerts the police," he said. "Quick response time out here." She thanked him and walked to the front porch to hang the final piece of her quiet defense, a discreet but unmistakable sign. "Private property, no trespassing. Enforced under historical protection statute." The sign didn't feel hostile, it felt earned. By noon, an email pinged her phone. She opened it slowly, expecting another form or follow-up request. Instead, her eyes widened at the bold heading. "Historic status, approved, permanent designation effective immediately." The PDF shimmered on her screen, full of state seals and signatures. She read through the details twice, absorbing each line. The house could never be rezoned, never demolished, never altered beyond preservation standards. Not by her, not by whoever came after her, not by anyone who saw it as a dollar sign instead of a legacy. Her shoulders loosened with a release she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Minutes later, a second email arrived from the Preservation Board. "Public recognition ceremony scheduled. Location: Miller Residence. Date: 2 weeks." Elaine pressed a hand to her chest, not out of surprise but gratitude. The house that had sheltered her family for generations wasn't simply being saved, it was being honored. She wasn't prepared for what happened next. Word traveled fast through the neighborhood, faster than she expected, faster than she was ready for. By mid-afternoon, a soft knock sounded at her door. Mrs. Green from across the street stood there holding a small bouquet of wildflowers wrapped in twine. "I heard the news," she said. "Congratulations, this home deserves it." Then Mr. Ramos arrived with fresh lemons. Then a couple Elaine barely knew, smiling shyly, offering a handwritten note thanking her for preserving the last piece of the hill that still felt like the old town. One visitor became 2, then 5, then 11. Their kindness softened something in her, something she thought had been eroded by months of pressure and disappointment. By early evening, the house was filled with warm voices, quiet laughter, and neighbors reminiscing about the porch lantern her husband once restored. Elaine listened, surprised by how natural it felt to let people celebrate with her. Tessa slipped in last, carrying a small envelope. When everyone had stepped outside to admire the view, she leaned close and spoke softly. "You saved an entire chapter of history," she said. "Most people never get the chance, and even fewer have the courage." Elaine's eyes stung, not with sadness but with the depth of something she hadn't expected to feel today. Vindication almost softened into peace. The sun began to set, painting the valley gold as the guests trickled away. Elaine walked back inside, set the flowers on the dining table, and reached for her phone to scan the remaining unread messages. Only one notification stared back at her. From Dana. Short, bitter, final. "You've ruined everything." Elaine exhaled slowly and set the phone down. The house felt warm around her, the walls humming with a steadiness that seemed to rise from the floorboards themselves. She turned toward the staircase, ready to put the long day behind her. But the porch lantern flickered outside. Someone was still there. The figure on the porch turned out not to be Kyle, but a young woman with a camera bag slung over her shoulder. She stepped back when Elaine opened the door, offering a polite smile tinged with hesitation. "Mrs. Miller, I'm Claire Navarro with the San Luis Chronicle. The Preservation Board suggested I reach out. Would you be open to an interview about the designation?" Elaine blinked, surprised by the timing. After a moment, she nodded and invited her in. Claire set up lightly, small recorder notebook, nothing invasive. Her manner was gentle, respectful, as if she understood she was entering not just a home but a legacy. They settled in the living room. The late sun filtered through the stained glass window upstairs, casting fragments of color onto the hardwood floor. Claire clicked on the recorder. "Mrs. Miller, what does this home mean to you?" Elaine didn't rush her answer. She looked toward the beams overhead, the ones her father had polished until they gleamed, and let her thoughts settle like dust in warm air. "This house," she said slowly, "is a piece of how this community began. My grandfather built these rooms with his own hands. My husband restored what time tried to take. Every board here carries someone's hard work, not just mine." Claire nodded, jotting notes. Was it difficult to preserve it through the process? Elaine smiled faintly. Everything worth keeping requires care and people willing to do the work. She continued speaking, not about the fight with her son, not about fear, betrayal, or the pressure she had endured. Instead, she told Claire about old neighborhood potlucks, the craftsman traditions of the early 1900s, and how the house had once served as a gathering spot for newly settled families on the hill. She mentioned her grandfather's sketches, her father's steady patience, her husband's devotion to restoring the banister. But she never spoke a word about Kyle. Not out of spite, but because he simply wasn't part of the story she wanted to preserve. When Claire finished her questions and packed up, she paused at the threshold. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "This kind of history is rare." Elaine walked her out and watched her disappear down the winding road, the recorder with its captured stories tucked safely inside her bag. By the next morning, the article was online. A hilltop treasure, the Miller residence and the legacy one family saved. The headline sat above a photo of Elaine standing on her porch, sunlight turning her gray hair silver. The story unfolded with elegance, detailing the home's architectural lineage, its protected status, and Elaine's role in safeguarding a slice of local history. It was warm, it was proud. And it included not a single mention of Kyle or Dana. Across town, Kyle read the article on his tablet. At first he skimmed, jaw tight, shoulders stiff, until realization crashed over him. His name wasn't there, not even a footnote. The article told the story of the house, the lineage, the preservation, but not the battle. Not the coercion. Not the ultimatum he tried to force. He set the tablet down, eyes burning with something he hadn't felt in years, not anger, but something closer to grief. The legacy he'd expected to inherit had moved on without him. The story lived, he did not. Dana reacted differently. She went straight to social media, posting a barrage of thinly veiled complaints, accusations that Elaine had been manipulated, that the board had overstepped, that the house had been stolen from the rightful family. But her tone was brittle, transparent, and the comments flooded in quickly. People from town. Former neighbors. Even strangers who valued preservation. Most replies were blunt. "This isn't about you. It's her house, her history. Sounds like jealousy to me." Within hours, Dana deleted every post. Meanwhile, Elaine received an email from the Miller Community Education Fund. The subject line glowed. "First applications received, review recommended." She opened the message. There were 3 submissions so far, all from local students eager to study architecture or preservation. Their essays were earnest, their ambitions grounded, their gratitude unmistakable. Elaine felt her chest warm quietly, deeply. For the first time in months, the future felt steady. She closed her laptop, ready to step outside for some air, when movement at the window caught her attention. A car she recognized too well had just pulled into the driveway. And this time the engine didn't shut off. The car in the driveway idled for a long moment before the engine finally cut off. Elaine stood still in the hallway, her hand resting lightly on the banister as she watched the shadow in the window. Kyle had come, of course he had. She felt no fear, only the familiar ache of someone who kept choosing disappointment over understanding. But Ode wasn't about him. She stepped away from the window and entered the dining room where a small group waited. Ron sat at the far end of the table, reviewing the documents with the careful patience of someone who understood the magnitude of each signature. Tessa stood nearby, double-checking the trust paperwork, verifying timestamps, ensuring every legal thread was pulled taut. And sitting closest to Elaine was Jamie Lawson, her former student from a decade ago, now a local teacher. Jamie looked older, more sure of herself, but the earnest steadiness Elaine remembered still lived in her eyes. "Ready?" Jamie asked softly. Elaine nodded and took her seat. Her lawyer slid the final form forward, the living transfer agreement. Once signed, the house would no longer be part of her estate. It would belong to the Heritage Trust now, in the present, beyond the reach of any challenge. Her pen moved with calm precision. Elaine Miller. Date signed today. Witnesses present. The last line locked into place with a flourish of ink. Outside, a car door slammed hard. Kyle's footsteps pounded across the front walk, up the steps, onto the porch. Each one sounded angrier than the last. Elaine didn't flinch. She handed the pen to Ron, who added his witness signature without hesitation. The front door rattled under Kyle's fist. "Mom, open the door, we're talking about this now." Elaine didn't move toward the sound. Instead, she passed the next document to Jamie, the appointment naming her administrator and eventual caretaker of the property. Jamie's breath caught as she read the heading, but she didn't hesitate. She signed her name carefully, almost reverently. Kyle's voice cracked through the wood. "Are you kidding me? Let me in." Ron exchanged a glance with Elaine, silently offering support if she needed it, but she simply sat straighter. The next step was ceremonial. Elaine reached into the velvet pouch resting near her elbow and drew out the original keys, heavy, aged brass engraved with the faint outline of her grandfather's initials. She had held them her entire life. They had survived 3 generations, 2 world wars, an earthquake that rattled the hill 40 years ago. She placed them gently in Jamie's hands. "Protect it like it protected me." Jamie swallowed hard, a sheen of emotion in her eyes. "I will," she whispered, "I promise." The door shook again, harder this time. "Mom, what is going on? Open this door right now." Elaine rose, not to answer him but to adjust the blinds just enough to see outside. Kyle stood on the porch, face red, pacing, fists clenching and unclenching. He looked like a man staring at the ruins of a future he had built in his mind without ever consulting the person who actually owned it. Through the narrow opening in the blinds, he finally noticed movement behind him, Ron standing at the dining table, Tessa reviewing signatures, Jamie holding the keys, and Elaine overseeing it all. He froze. His eyes widened as the truth hit him like a blow. This wasn't just a meeting. This was the ceremony. And he wasn't invited. Elaine let the blinds fall back into place. Behind her, the lawyer stamped the final page, sealing the transfer permanent, irrevocable. The house was no longer hers to leave to anyone. Especially not to him. And when Kyle finally backed away from the porch, shaking with disbelief, Elaine knew another confrontation was coming. Only this time he had nothing left to take. The week after the living transfer, the house settled into a new kind of calm, one Elaine hadn't known she was craving until the silence arrived without tension folded beneath it. The air inside felt lighter, as if the walls themselves had finally stopped bracing for impact. Elaine woke early each morning and walked through the rooms as the sun slowly warmed the floors, not to check for what might be taken but to decide what she wanted to care for next. She refreshed the paint in the hallway, choosing a soft cream that brightened the narrow space without erasing its age. She replaced the upstairs railing with a stronger oak handrail, crafted by a local carpenter who understood how to blend old with new discreetly. And in the garden, she treated herself to a set of sturdy tools, the kind her husband always said were worth every penny if you meant to stay a while. She meant to stay. By the following Thursday, the dining room was set for the first meeting of the scholarship board. Only 2 weeks ago, the same room held fear, confrontation, and a battle line she never asked for. Now she arranged a bowl of lemons at the center of the table, opened the windows to let in the ocean breeze, and listened as chairs scraped softly across the floor. The board members arrived: 3 young teachers, 1 retired architect, and Jamie, who looked both nervous and proud in her new role. Their enthusiasm filled the room quickly, spilling into laughter and overlapping conversation as they discussed application guidelines, interview criteria, and ways to honor the history woven into the scholarship's purpose. Elaine sat quietly at first, watching them bring energy into a space once weighed down by conflict. She realized then that legacy didn't always require family. Sometimes it required intention. Sometimes it required choosing who would carry the story forward. Near the end of the meeting, Ron stepped in holding a small, cloth-wrapped object. His eyes crinkled as he handed it to her. "Thought you might want this back where it belongs." Elaine unfolded the cloth slowly. Inside lay an antique brass door knocker, the original one from the house's earliest days, polished to a warm glow. The shape was simple but elegant, the metal heavy in her hands. "I found it in my workshop," Ron said. "Your husband took it down years ago, planned to repair the hinge, but time got away from him." Elaine traced the curve of the metal with her thumb. He would have loved seeing it restored. Ron smiled. "Then let's give it a second life." They installed it together on the front door, the metal catching the late afternoon sun. The sound it made when tested, solid, resonant, felt like the home reclaiming its voice. As they finished, Tessa walked up the porch steps carrying a velvet case. Her expression softened when she opened it to reveal the historic protection plaque, polished bronze, engraved with the state seal and the official designation. "Ready to hang this?" she asked, though her voice wavered slightly. Elaine nodded. Tessa lifted the plaque with both hands, securing it beside the entryway with slow, reverent care. When she stepped back, tears blurred her eyes. "You didn't just save a house," she said quietly. "You saved context, meaning." Elaine placed a gentle hand on her arm, a silent thank you for everything Tessa had carried with her. As the evening cooled, the scholarship board lingered on the lawn, laughing and calling across the yard as they packed up. Elaine slipped off her shoes and stepped into the grass, letting the blades brush against her feet. The breeze carried the scent of jasmine and fresh soil, and for the first time in years she felt her breath settle without weight behind it. She looked at the house, the beams, the windows, the soft glow inside, and felt peace widen through her chest. A future she chose. A home she kept. A story she reshaped. She closed her eyes, letting the breeze lift the last remnants of tension from her shoulders. But when she opened them again, something at the edge of the property caught her attention. A car had stopped across the road. Not Kyle's, something unfamiliar. The driver watched the house for a long beat before slowly stepping out. Elaine straightened slightly, the grass cool beneath her feet. Whoever they were. They hadn't come by accident. A year later, the hilltop felt different, alive in a way Elaine hadn't seen since she was a child, running barefoot across the yard while her father sanded the banister on the porch. The morning sun cast long, gentle beams across the grass as a small crowd gathered at the foot of the walkway. Students, parents, teachers, and a few longtime residents stood together, listening as Jamie welcomed them to the first official community tour hosted by the Miller Heritage Trust. Elaine watched from the top of the steps, the breeze lifting a strand of her gray hair as the students craned their necks to take in the home's sweeping eaves and artful woodwork. Their curiosity radiated across the lawn, filling the space with an energy she'd grown to cherish. The house, once a battleground of tension and fear, now hummed with possibility. She guided them inside, her steps steady, her voice warm but confident. "This beam here," she said, lifting her hand toward the polished wood above the entryway, "was finished by my father when he was younger than most of you. He spent an entire summer making sure the grain looked exactly the way his father wanted." The group edged closer, eyes reflecting the amber light filtering through the windows. She took them room by room, pointing out the small details that held stories: the brass hinges her husband restored one winter, the stained glass panel her grandmother designed, the handmade joinery preserved beneath a century's worth of careful hands. Some students scribbled notes, others simply stood silently, absorbing the weight of the space. By the time they reached the backyard, Jamie stepped forward for her portion of the tour. She paused on the brick path, looking out at the students with a quiet, deliberate pride. her voice carried without force. This home stands because someone refused to be erased. The words settled over the group, firm but gentle, and a few students nodded, understanding more than their years should allow. After the tour concluded, the visitors dispersed onto the lawn, taking photos, tracing woodwork with reverent fingertips, asking Jamie how they could volunteer with the trust. Elaine lingered near the porch steps, let their voices drift around her like soft music. She eased herself down onto the rebuilt front porch, the boards smooth beneath her palms, the sun warm across her hands. The porch had once been a place of dread where Kyle's anger had echoed against the siding. Now it felt like the heart of something restored. She reached for her journal, flipping to a blank page, but before she began writing, a movement across the street caught her attention. A car she recognized slowed to a stop near the curb. Kyle sat behind the wheel, one hand gripping the steering wheel, the other resting motionlessly in his lap. His face was thinner, his expression unreadable from the distance. He watched the house quietly, watching the people who had come to admire it, watching the laughter drifting across the yard. Watching the legacy he had tried and failed to control. Elaine didn't move, neither did he. For a long moment, they existed in the same silence, separated by a decade's worth of choices neither could undo. Then Kyle blinked, looked at the crowd one last time, and drove away without ever opening his door. Elaine let out a soft breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She lowered her gaze to the journal in her lap and wrote with a steady hand. Legacy isn't inherited, it's earned. She closed the book gently, resting her palm on the cover as sunlight warmed her skin. The students' laughter floated through the open window, mingling with the rustle of oak leaves above. She looked up at the old home, its beams strong, its history preserved, its future secure, and felt the kind of peace that comes only when a battle has ended on your own terms. He once told her it was just a house. She smiled, quiet and sure. He said it was just a house, but houses remember who protected them and who didn't.